Getting closer to God was something I wanted and desperately thought I needed. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting the scarf I tied neatly around my head. It was a soft lilac shade, perfectly complementing my white blouse and long black skirt. I tilted my head, inspecting myself one last time. I didn't look bad at all. My phone buzzed, cutting through the silence of the room. I reached for it, smiling faintly when I saw Calista's name flashing on the screen. "Where are you, madam?" She barked the moment I picked up, her voice filled with mock impatience. "It's 5 minutes to 8. The mass is about to start." "I'm coming, Kalista," I replied, laughing softly. Before she could press further, I hung up. Sometimes she reminded me of my mother, hurrying me to get ready for school when I was younger. It was endearing in a way. She wasn't a bad friend, really. In fact, she was a great friend, and I felt guilty for not reciprocating her energy. But I just wasn't in the mood to form close friendships anymore. I'd learned how they often ended: jealousy, gossip, and disappointment. Better to keep things surface level. By the time I reached the church, the congregation was already deep into the Gloria chant. I spotted Kalista near the middle pews, waving subtly to catch my attention. Sliding in beside her, I gave her a quick nod of greeting. "You are late," she whispered, though there was no malice in her tone. She wore a beautiful green gown that hugged her figure perfectly, and I couldn't help but notice that she smelled different. Pleasant, sweet, almost floral. Had she changed her perfume? "You don't look bad at all," I whispered, leaning slightly toward her. "Thanks," she replied, smiling. "And you? At least you made it." I chuckled softly, my voice barely audible over the hymn. I wanted to ask about her perfume, maybe even compliment her on the change, but I held back. No need to overdo it. As the priest ascended the pulpit for the sermon, Kalista leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, a new priest." "Uh-huh," I muttered, glancing at the man. He was hard to miss: chubby cheeks, broad shoulders, and a warm, approachable presence. It didn't escape me that he looked a bit like Kalista. "You two look alike, Seth," I whispered to her, unable to resist. Kalista turned to me, eyes wide. "Ha! Abeg o, from where to where na?" she whispered back, her voice tinged with mock horror. I stifled a laugh, pressing my lips together to avoid causing a scene. But I couldn't stop myself from enjoying the comparison. It was all harmless fun, after all. When the announcement period came, the priest introduced himself. "Good morning, my beloved parishioners. I am Father Callistus Ogedengbe, your new parish priest." I froze, my mind catching on the name like a hook. Callistus, Kalista. My lips twitched involuntarily, and I quickly glanced at Kalista, who was already looking at me, her eyes narrowing knowingly. "Don't you dare," she mouthed, but it was too late. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a tidal wave, and I nearly burst out laughing. Clamping a hand over my mouth, I tried to disguise my snort as a cough. The elderly woman seated in the pew ahead turned sharply, fixing us with a glare that could rival a thunderstorm. "You are in church!" she hissed, her voice low but dripping with reprimand. "Sorry," we whispered in unison, bowing our heads in embarrassment. Kalista nudged me with her elbow, her lips twitching despite her efforts to stay composed. "What are the odds?" I whispered, unable to help myself. "Kalista and Callistus." "Wow." Shut up, she muttered, though her quiet giggle betrayed her. We spent the rest of the announcements in silent camaraderie, both fighting the urge to laugh as the moment lingered. The teasing was cute while it lasted, but after the 10th time of joking about how cute Kalista and Father Callistus would look as a couple if he hadn't joined the priesthood, her expression shifted. She frowned, her smile fading into a tight line. "It's all right," she said, her voice firm. "It's really not that funny anymore." Her tone caught me off guard. I blinked at her. "Why are you sounding so depressed?" "It's just a joke," I retorted, confused by her sudden mood change. "A very long one," she shot back, not meeting my eyes. "And I'm tired. Let's just change the subject." Her discomfort was palpable, and for the first time, I felt a twinge of awkwardness. Had I overstepped? As the taxi pulled up to her place, she turned to me, her face softening as if she regretted snapping. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a laugh. "Must be my period acting up." Haha. I studied her for a moment, noticing how her chest rose and fell as if she were trying to calm herself. Weird girl, I thought to myself. "It's fine," I replied with a faint smile, letting it slide. She smiled back weakly and quickly slammed the taxi door, hurrying into her compound without looking back. The next day, I nearly dropped my bag when I saw Kalista walk into the office. She looked different. Multiple piercings now adorned her nose, including a tiny silver ring, and her fingers were covered with an array of mismatched rings. She wore an air of quiet defiance, as if daring anyone to comment. "Wow," I said, raising an eyebrow. "Seems you were very busy after church yesterday. What are you now? Lady of the Rings?" She paused for a second, staring at me with an unreadable expression, then silently walked to her desk. "What's the matter?" I pressed, sitting beside her. "You've been so uptight since yesterday after Mass. Is it about Father Callistus?" "I was only kidding, you know." She sighed heavily and shook her head, her gaze fixed on her computer screen. "It's not about him. Just drop it, Ruby." Her tone was dismissive, and the wall she had put up between us was clear. I leaned back, deciding not to push further. Later that day, Richard, our branch manager, walked into the office, his sharp presence commanding everyone's attention. He glanced in my direction and said, "Ruby, don't forget to see me after work." My stomach tightened slightly, and I nodded. I hadn't told Kalista about the competition Richard was preparing me for. It wasn't necessary. I didn't want her, or anyone else, feeling awkward or spreading rumors about why the branch manager was paying attention to me alone. If the company felt the information was important for others, they would circulate it. Kalista, however, had noticed. She stared at me, then at Richard, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decode some hidden message. Her expression was one I couldn't quite place. Curiosity, resentment. That evening, after everyone had wrapped up their tasks, Kalista lingered at her desk, waiting. I grabbed my bag, preparing to head to Richard's office. Um, "I think you should be going," I said, noticing her watching me. She smiled faintly, but with a hint of sarcasm. "Yeah, sure. You're meeting with the branch manager," she said, her tone almost confrontational. I frowned. "Why did you say it like that?" She shook her head and grabbed her bag. "I guess I read you wrong." Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the office, leaving me standing there, puzzled. Richard and I spent the next 3 hours poring over technical material, preparing for the international competition. He handed me a massive book that felt more like an encyclopedia, titled Algorithms and Systems Designed for Scalability. We are starting with scalable system architecture, he said, opening to a bookmarked page. This competition is less about coding syntax and more about problem solving and presenting innovative solutions. You will need to demonstrate how to build systems that can handle real world complexities. I nodded, flipping through the dense pages. Your first task, he continued, is to design a theoretical solution for managing data synchronization in a distributed system. Assume the system involves real time communication, and any delay could result in significant data loss. I blinked. Distributed systems? That's a lot to unpack. He smirked. That's the point. You'll face tougher challenges than this during the competition. Start with the basics. How would you ensure consistency across nodes? Over the next hours, we discussed load balancers, data replication, and conflict resolution algorithms. Richard pushed me to think critically, challenging every assumption I made. By the end of the session, my head was spinning, but I felt a strange exhilaration. You are getting there, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. Keep this pace and you'll do well. True to his word, he booked a cab for me after the session. As I sank into the back seat, exhaustion washed over me, but so did a sense of accomplishment. This routine quickly became our norm. Late nights at the office, intense brainstorming sessions, and cab rides home. But something else had shifted. Kalista. She had grown distant, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary. Women and unnecessary attitude, I muttered under my breath one evening, shrugging it off as I watched her ignore me for the third time that day. Good thing I hadn't let her into my space. Mr. Richard and I started spending more time together. The late evenings spent brainstorming over dense computer science material morphed into casual dinners after work. It wasn't something we had planned, it just started happening. After a particularly long day, he suggested grabbing a quick meal at a restaurant nearby, and it became a routine. I learned things about him I hadn't expected. For one, he loved fried rice but hated peas. He'd meticulously pick them out, piling them into the side of his plate like a child. Why don't you just tell them to leave the peas out? I teased one evening, watching him poke at his plate. Where is the fun in that? He replied, smirking. Besides, they are too stubborn to listen. Like you. Me. Stubborn. I laughed, shaking my head. I'm the picture of compliance. Right, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He'd occasionally crack jokes, some of which were actually funny, and I found myself laughing once or twice despite myself. The man, who once seemed like an untouchable, condescending boss, was slowly revealing a lighter, more relatable side. Eventually, he started offering to drop me off at home instead of booking a cab. I tried to decline the first few times, but he was persistent. It's safer, he said, and it's on my way. One evening, after he dropped me off, he hesitated as he parked in front of my gate. Ruby, he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Can I use your restroom? I don't think I can hold it till I get home. Sure, I said, a bit surprised. We both got out of the car and I led him into the house, pointing him toward the guest restroom. As he emerged a few minutes later, I couldn't help but smile at the sight of him. Mr. Richard, my stoic and polished boss, looking slightly disheveled in my modest home. He seemed almost human. Thanks, he said, brushing his hands on his trousers. No problem. He was about to head for the door when the light suddenly went out. Ah, NEPA, we groaned in unison. I sighed, knowing what had to be done. Now I have to pull that generator, I muttered. He turned to me, eyebrows raised. You pull a generator? With your hands? I nodded, laughing. Na lie, he said, slipping into pidgin. Who you dey whine? You, like this. With which muscle? I laughed so hard my chest burned. Not you speaking pidgin, I gasped between giggles. Easy, easy, babe, he said, his tone playful. I froze. Did he just call me babe? Before I could respond, my phone rang from the cushion where I had left it earlier. Who is that? He asked, watching me as I reached for it. Oh, just Kalista, I said, glancing at the screen before letting it ring out. Cool. You two are friends, right? Yeah, I replied, sitting back down. He nodded thoughtfully. By the way, you should inform your colleagues about the competition. It's actually open to everyone, not just for the retention program at the end of the internship. It skipped my mind. I wanted to mentor just one person, but it's fair to let others know. Relief washed over me. Thanks, I wasn't sure whether I should tell them or not, especially since it wasn't general information. But I guess I can now. He smiled, and in the darkness, I felt his gaze linger on me a moment longer than necessary. Let me help you with the generator, he offered suddenly. I started to protest, but he insisted. You can't be dragging that thing alone. I led him to the back of the house where my small generator sat. He pulled it effortlessly, the machine roaring to life. You see? He said, grinning as he dusted off his hands. That wasn't so hard. I rolled my eyes, laughing. Thanks. He washed his hands, getting ready to leave. As he walked toward the door, he turned to me. So, see you at work on Monday, he said. Yeah, see you. But he didn't move right away. Instead, he stood there studying me in the dim glow of the generator powered bulb outside. What? I asked, suddenly self conscious under his gaze. Out of nowhere, he took my hand, his grip warm and firm, and leaned in to kiss me. It was brief, too brief to process, but long enough to make my heart race. I immediately pulled back, shaking my head. We shouldn't be doing this, I said, my voice trembling. I'm really sorry, he said, stepping back and rubbing the back of his head. I don't know why I. Let's pretend that didn't happen. Good night, he called softly as he hurried to his car, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. That night, I stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around me, and made my way to the bedroom to put on my pajamas. As I slipped on the loose fabric, my phone buzzed again. Oh, Kalista, I murmured, remembering her missed call earlier. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Kalista. It was Salome. My chest tightened. It had been months since I had last heard from her, and now, out of the blue, she was calling. The phone rang insistently, but I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. I stared at the screen, watching it buzz, until the call ended. A few seconds later, it started ringing again. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen, before finally swiping to answer. For a moment, there was only silence on both ends. Then I heard her breathing, shallow and uneven. Ruby, she finally choked out, her voice breaking. My heart clenched. I'm so sorry, she whispered. And then, to my shock, she broke down, crying. I can't do this anymore.